Hi, I'm Christine Shaw, and I want to welcome you to a presentation while also taking the opportunity to encourage your participation as I seek to serve as a and juvenile justice system as it relates specifically to juvenile sex offenders. And I also want to highlight the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006. Now, looking at the overview, I first want to highlight the Department of Juvenile Justice, Statute 985.601, Sections 3A, and then I would like to also speak a little bit about the American Bar Association. Now, the Juvenile Justice Department, they have the task of protecting the public from acts of delinquency. This is interesting because clearly this tells us that the topic of juvenile sex abuse is one that is controversial. So currently, a sex offender has to be at least the age of 14 to be criminally charged. So instead of convicting these juveniles, they are adjudicated as delinquent. So in the state of Florida, a delinquency adjudication for any qualifying sex offense can require the juvenile to register as a sex offender for 25 years or perhaps for the rest of their life. But the issue and the gap comes in the fact that they have to be at least 14 years old. There was some recent research that I did, and in using the random sample that I had, the age group that was committing the most of the sexual abuse acts in Hillsborough County was primarily ages 10 to 13. And 13 was the highest age in this particular research that I did. And so it was so interesting, and then to find out that here it is, even working in child welfare, I'm actually having contact with these juvenile offenders and also with the victims, and we need to advocate for more services. Let me draw your attention to the right side of this particular PowerPoint where it talks about juvenile sex offenders. And this particular data is from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Office of Justice Programs. And so I thought this statistical chart was very interesting. They dealt with about 89,000 juveniles. And so of those juvenile sex offenders, this was the number that was known to police in the United States. And so looking at percentages, they found that a percentage of all sex offenders were about maybe 26%, but then 93% of those offenders were boys. And so that's pretty concerning. And then they're saying that 3% percentage are juvenile offenses, which is really interesting because working in the field, we're seeing different data. 5% younger than 9 years old, and then younger than 12 years old, about 16% of that, and then 38% between 12 and 14 years old, and then between the ages of 15 and 17 years old, 46%. Very, very interesting information here. So now, as we continue with our overview, I'd like to look at Public Law 109-248. This is also for the state of Florida. There's a call to action for policymakers and advocates to learn more and more about our child sexual abuse laws. And of course, this particular law focuses on protecting children from sexual exploitation, violent crimes, permitting child abuse, child pornography, and to promote internet safety and to honor the memory, of course, of Adam Walsh and other child crimes. And I would like to just kind of give you a little information about Adam Walsh. Adam John Walsh was born on November the 14th, and he was pronounced dead on July the 27th back in 1981 when a part of his body was found. This particular child, he was an American child, and he was abducted from a Sears department store at a Hollywood mall located in Hollywood, Florida, and that happened on July the 27th in 1981. Shockingly, his severed head was found 2 weeks later in a drainage canal alongside Highway 60, and this was in the area near Hee Haw Junction in a rural area in the Indian River County, Florida. And so his father, John Walsh, became an advocate for victims of violent crimes and hosted the America's Most Wanted television program. And so that particular program was viewed by over 38 million people. So definitely we see that there's a need for more action from our policymakers and also from social work advocates regarding juvenile sex offenders. I'd like to take a look at some data, the overall issues and reason for concern in dealing with juveniles who are committing sexual behaviors. It's important to indicate that the American Bar Association is also advocating for the Florida legislature to modify Section 985.03 to change the term of juvenile sex offender to juveniles with sexual behavioral problems. This is interesting because they feel that the term juvenile sex offender should be reserved for youth transferred to adult court for their sexual offenders. So that's pretty interesting information. Also, too, I want to highlight that the sexual abuse remains an acute public health issue. 1 in 4 children born female at birth and 1 in 13 born male at birth experience sexual abuse victimization before they're even 18 years old. And 35% of that abuse is perpetrated by another youth. So this is where we start to see some of the gaps because we're focusing on those 14 and older, but what about the younger children as well? There's also limited sexual abuse services for families. This is still a problem that exists today because working in child welfare, there's so many resources such as the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay and Chrysalis Health that we're able to refer the victims to, but what are those who have actually committed and perpetrated the crime against them? Also, too, there's a lack of reporting to law enforcement for all sexual battery cases involving victims under the age of 12. This is still occurring, especially in Hillsborough County. And so we often, when we're interviewing parents, doing our psychosocial assessments and walking through protective capacities with the family, doing those assessments, looking at their family functioning and issues and things that's happening along the past, oftentimes parents reveal and disclose things that have happened between their children. And when we ask them if they reported it, they advise us that they did not. They tried to work it out as a family. And so that brings us to our next point, that long-term psychosocial impact. We've got to start looking at that for intrafamilial, butchering that word, intrafamilial child on child sexual abuse and victims' coping skills. We don't understand what their coping skills are. Can you imagine these victims that are still living in the home? Some are still sharing the same bedroom with the very youth that perpetrated against them. And so clearly we understand that there is a gap in available interventions for not only the child victims, but also for the juveniles with the sexual behavioral problems. And this needs to be closed. We need to pull this gap together. So one of my new mottos is let's shatter the silence. We want to help them stop sexual abuse. So as a child welfare employee as well as a social worker, I'm looking forward to help shatter the silence about how big this problem of juvenile sex offending is in the state of Florida. This brings us to what is the ask? What is needed? At this time, want to kind of highlight some things that I think would be very, very important in this day and age. The American Bar Association is doing a lot of advocating, but also too, the National Association of Social Workers, they have a legislative priority this year to expand services for school-age children. And so expanding these services that would combat this ridiculous epidemic of mental health crisis within our school age children and also the survivors of trauma, this is really imperative. Notably, treatment for sexual offenders is often viewed as controversial, as we said before, but we have to take note of recidivism. Without intervention, the tendency remains for them to relapse into that sexual offending behavior. So what's our ask? We need more funding for comprehensive psychosocial assessments for juveniles with these behaviors. We need to increase awareness of empirical risk assessments being completed for juvenile sex offenders. We also, and I admit that I need this myself, improve training for social workers and mental health providers who are conducting these assessments. We also need to have policy and accountability for an increase in using the juvenile sex offender assessment protocol number 2. They call it the JSOAP number 2 in child welfare agencies. And so the problem is that many are using the tool, but they don't know what the next step is. Where do we get services? How do we intervene? Because there's not enough available services unless the child has been adjudicated dependent. And so in criminal court. And so school-based initiatives aimed at preventing sexual misconduct and abuse are definitely needed. And we need to look at amending the laws and policies that require our juvenile sex offenders to register if adjudicated in court, and also whether they are not adjudicated in court. If it comes to the attention of law enforcement and to child welfare, there needs to be processes and protocols in place so that these children can begin registering for their behavior so they can be more closely monitored. This is the exciting part to me. Advocacy at work, taking action. What can we do? Well, one of the things that I would like to say is that I had an absolute wonderful time drafting a letter to the Honorable Senator Jim Boyd of the state of Florida. And of course, his office is located at 717 Manatee Avenue West, Suite 100 in Bradenton, Florida, which is very, very close to us. And so I had the opportunity to highlight my ask in that letter, and I'm super excited for his response. And I've also volunteered to participate in any upcoming advocacy events or efforts that he has coming up. And so if you would like to join the fight for victims of sexual abuse and the fight for amended policies, laws, and interventions for these juveniles with sexual behaviors, then I urge you and I encourage you to please join me in reaching out to Senator Jim Boyd. This has been a presentation on juvenile sex offender policy highlighting the Adam Walsh Act. Thank you and have a great day.